was a moment where people were sensing that the hostage deal was close. And so this was that final call as they're standing outside of the seats of government across the country, yelling at these buildings that, who knows who's inside, who's listening at 9, 10 o'clock at night, but just screaming, get a deal done, no matter what, just end this.
Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets in Israel overnight, calling for a deal to release hostages held by Hamas. In Tel Aviv, protesters chanted, "War is not holy, life is," some of them accusing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of aiming to prolong the conflict. Talks aimed at achieving a ceasefire have resumed in Cairo this weekend. Zach Anders is a journalist joining us from Tel Aviv. Good morning, Zach.
Good morning, Cal.
First of all, just reflect for us the scale of the protests, the message of the protests, and I suppose something of the anger of the protesters by the sound of it.
Well, in Tel Aviv, thousands yesterday. Also, a sizable crowd in Jerusalem that was considerably more violent with the arrests that were taking place as they were busting through barriers. The Tel Aviv protest has become so routine now that the police has personal relationships with the protesters, and they do this nightly dance. So the Tel Aviv protest is peaceful, but it shuts down roads. There was also another in Beersheba, in Israel's south, all across the country. It was a moment where people were sensing that the hostage deal was close. And so this was that final call as they're standing outside of the seats of government across the country, yelling at these buildings that, who knows who's inside, who's listening at 9, 10 o'clock at night, but just screaming, get a deal done, no matter what, just end this.
You were there in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv last night, speaking to some of the protesters. Let's have a listen.
But every time when the deal is coming and then we hear about maybe it's not going to happen, maybe there's some difficulties with the government that is not going to make it happen, our government has to have it happen. We may have to make it happen now. There's no more time, and we say it for 7 months.
In my mind, Rafah is not important. I'm an officer in the IDF for 30 years. This is a war that didn't start yesterday. It's not going to end tomorrow. They have to bring the hostages, and all the rest needs to wait, Rafah or anything else. I hope, of course, for a deal, but the way the government talks, it doesn't seem that they're interested in releasing the hostages. They want the victory. A victory. We have a war here for 100 years. We'll not have a victory, not this week and not next week.
Zach, I find what that gentleman was saying really quite fascinating, that the government thinking more about victory than releasing the hostages, even if that is not the reality of the government's position. If that is the perception of the government's position, that is hugely damaging to Benjamin Netanyahu.
It is, and it's the position that they've put themselves into a corner by saying that the Rafah operation publicly is going to happen no matter what, and there will be an end to Hamas. And that's not anything new, but did it need to be said, every day during this finish line sprint of the negotiations, especially when Hamas, on the day that Hamas comes out and says, we're taking this in a positive light, we think that this is close, and they're communicating to Arab partners that they're willing to accept a deal that doesn't necessarily include a complete end to the conflict. At the same time, the prime minister is going to come out and say, it doesn't matter much because we're still going to go into Rafah, and he's placating his far-right coalitions and saying, don't worry to Ben Gvir, to Smotrich, don't worry, we're still going to go into Rafah, we're still going to have this incursion. But we're going to get a deal done somehow. And the public's reaction is, how can you possibly get a deal done if Hamas is sitting here saying, we're giving you an option for hostages back, but we want to see an end to the conflict. And that's, again, what we saw last night is the sources coming out of the negotiating team in Cairo saying that Hamas, Sinwar, received the deal inside the tunnel network, that he communicated back that it was positive, but they still are not budging on this end to the conflict. Now, whether or not they are willing to accept a first phase of the hostage deal and release the 33 agreed hostages and then continue negotiating for an end during the second or third phase, for a total end of the conflict is what they're trying to negotiate at some point during the stages of the ceasefire, which I know is kind of confusing, but that's just where we're at right now.
No, I hear you. What is interesting there and stands out there, first of all, is that the negotiations are still active on trying to reach some sort of deal. Secondly, that Hamas are engaging with those protests in Cairo as well. Does that feel like a change of atmosphere, even if it's a minor one, Zach, those sorts of elements of these conversations?
Yeah, things in the last 48 hours have certainly, the pitch has changed considerably. Hamas speaking much more frequently, through their spokespeople and out into their media apparatus, especially a lot of reports in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Qatar giving some movement. I think that was interesting to see them say that they would be willing to end the partnership in some regards and close the Hamas political office in Qatar. We're seeing a lot of, just all throughout the region, a lot of movement. The U.S. is dangling a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, contingent on a deal with Israel, contingent on normalization between Jerusalem and Riyadh. So it's like all these parties are trying to fix the Middle East at the same time. There's a lot of movement. The U.S. maybe gave some assurances. We got reports in Israel yesterday that the U.S. was providing assurances to Hamas that this would see some sort of end to the conflict if they agreed to this ceasefire. The Israelis are refuting this, but also saying, the Americans are making their own statements, and we, the Israelis, are negotiating on our own. When we are ready to agree to a deal, we'll send the plane to Cairo. And at late last night, all throughout the day, we were watching to see if that Israeli jet that would take the Mossad director, Barnea, to Cairo, if it was going to take off from somewhere in Israel, and it never did. So what we'll watch again for today, that would be a sign that the Israeli delegation, is going back to Cairo and willing to continue the talks.
Zach, thank you so much. It's good to speak to you and to hear you reporting from Hostage Square as well. Thanks for speaking to us this morning. Zach Anders there, reporting from Tel Aviv.